This is Dateline News and Conversation. We've got two important topics to talk about tonight. There's an awful lot that's been happening over the last few days. First, we're going to talk about the importance of preserving the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights, which is under enormous assault right now. With this, the murder of Charlie Kirk, what we're seeing coming out of the mouths of Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, and Brendan Carr, Trump's appointment as the head of the Federal Communications Commission, threatening that more people like Jimmy Kimmel and others are going to go the same way he did. This is an incredible assault on our First Amendment rights. Donald Trump and Vance are also indicating they plan on clamping down on anybody who speaks out against what happened to Charlie Kirk, his funeral yesterday. And this is really a terrifying development. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what's happening in the Middle East. That's a powder keg that has got me and a lot of other people terrified. My guest tonight is going to help us connect the dots between the use of divide and conquer, both here in the United States and in the Middle East. And we're going to find out who's behind it. My guest, she's back, the one and only Sylvia Demarest. Sylvia, welcome back.
Hey, Regis, how you doing?
I'm doing great, and I'm excited about what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to throw it to you, and you can pick it up with not only the assault on the First Amendment, but you're going to give us some historical context into what's been happening. So, Sylvia, take it away.
Well, Regis, first of all, I can't say that I completely endorse everything that you said in your opening monologue. Um, Let me just say this. In terms of human development and advancement, I think the adoption of the Bill of Rights to the United States Constitution is one of the most important developments in human history. The installment of the right to freedom of speech, to freedom of thought, to freedom of association, and the right to due process and the other rights, including the right to a trial by jury of your peers. These were important advancements in human history. And above all else, I think we all should unite in supporting the right to freedom of speech. Now, having said that, I also must point out that over the last several years, most of the assaults on freedom of speech have not come from what we call the right in the United States, but has come from the left. And that includes feeling as though words were somehow harmful when, as a kid, you would go around saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Now, all of a sudden, words are harmful. And that has something to do with what happened to Charlie Kirk, because Charlie Kirk didn't assault anybody. He didn't hit anybody. All he did was he talked. And if we cannot agree that regardless of whether or not we support what someone said, they have a right to say it, then that's a fundamental problem that we have in this country. The other major assault on freedom of speech has come from Zionist interests who want to curtail any discussion and any criticism whatsoever of Israel. The other assault on the Bill of Rights has come from, frankly, the war on terror and the panopticon of surveillance that the United States population and the other populations of the world have been subjected to. And in order to do that, you had to completely forget about due process, about the right to privacy, and all those other things. So there are many different ways of looking at this, but I think the important thing to remember here is that the Bill of Rights is important, that we need to, as American citizens, to unite behind the Bill of Rights. And we need to stop calling each other names. Charlie Kirk was not a fascist. He was not, he wasn't a racist. he was talking about issues and he was inviting other people to talk with him about issues. And so, as far as what's going on now in the Trump administration, I think we have a right to be concerned. On the other hand, I think and I don't agree with the FDA head opening up his mouth and talking about this. He needs to keep his mouth shut and let the private sector deal with these issues. The problem with Jimmy Kimmel was he only had 150,000 viewers and he was costing the network a great deal of money. And so it could have been a business decision to let him go, but unfortunately it got wrapped up in all these other issues, which is totally unfortunate. Um, so Regis, it's there's a lot going on, as you said, and I'm looking forward to discussing all of that with you here today.
Okay, well, we've got that not totally cleaned up and out of the way, but I appreciate how you centered that. I'd like you now to provide that historical context that you wrote so eloquently about in an article you wrote last week. So, can you bring us up to date on that?
Well, what I tried to do was I tried, first of all, to kind of review the history of how the use of violence and divide and conquer had allowed the entire era of discovery after the discovery of the Americas to create the colonial period, and how divide and conquer had been so central to that, how a little nation like Britain could control the entire Indian continent and extract an enormous amount of wealth from there and from all around the world. And I pointed out how the East Asia Company uh, at its peak had controlled 50% of world trade and had been worth about $7 trillion. And all of that had been essentially the result of the skillful use of both violence and divide and conquer to keep people fighting with each other rather than uniting to kick out the people that were basically ripping them off. And then I segued to the Ottoman Empire and showed how both before the Ottoman Empire in what was called the Golden Age of Islam, that the Islamic world had basically in the West at least, and in Western Asia, maintained civilization during the Dark Ages. That we have any or many of the old books from Rome and from Greece is due to the fact that the Islamic world preserved these books and used them and translated them into a number of different languages. They advanced progress in mathematics and medicine and architecture in so many different ways. This was the seat of civilization in the West for many, many years. The Ottoman Empire continued that progress, but because the West wanted to break up the Ottoman Empire, they began to develop the old divide and conquer. And the first thing they did in order to penetrate the Ottoman Empire was to form an alliance with the Wahhabs. This was part of the House of Saud, which was basically a tribal entity on the Arabian Peninsula that believed in a very backward and very fundamentalist form of Islam. And so, beginning with Britain, but ultimately including France and the United States, the Wahhabs were advanced as a way of breaking up the unity of Islam and installing the most backward form of Islam, so that you would have these gangs going around committing acts of atrocities and then creating the idea of terrorism, which has been so useful to the United States and to Israel and to the others in the wars that have taken place, especially since 9/11, and the creation of the problems that we see now in the Middle East. The Al Saud, the House of Saud, was used to create Saudi Arabia, and the Wahhabs is the official religion of the nation of Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabians spent billions of dollars spreading the Wahhabi religion around the world and basically indoctrinating an entire generation of young Muslims in the most backward fundamentalist form of Islam possible. And part of the reason why the Saudis did this, the royals did this, is that while the Wahhabi religion is very austere, they were drinking and having fun and partying and all of that. And the spread of this form of Islam was used as a countermeasure and a way of getting these young Islamists out of Saudi Arabia and fighting these battles around the world. And there were a number of these gangs that were created that the United States and Britain and France and the Saudis and other regimes in the Middle East supported. So basically, what happened was this fundamentalist form of Islam was used to break up the unity of the Islamic world, to install very backward regimes in the Middle East, and to prevent the Arab world from uniting into a world power, which they would have become otherwise.
Yeah, well, here we see it again. Uh, I think I'm correct. The United States and Great Britain uh, actually were the main actors in all this, weren't they? I mean, we can go
It's
back and look. We can go back and who supported the creation of Saudi Arabia, who supported and aided the creation of uh, the state of Israel, and they were pitted against each other to not only protect Israel but to the corporate oil interest of Great Britain and the United States. Is that not true?
Well, the whole point of colonialism is to basically take over an area that has resources and wealth and to channel those resources and wealth into the home country while using the area that's being occupied as a market for the products that the home country makes. And as a result of that, an enormous amount of wealth has been extracted from the global south, from Africa, from East Asia, from the Middle East over the last 500 years. And so the central theme of all of this has been the ability to use divide and conquer to keep the people of those areas confused and fighting themselves while the plotting and the scheming and the extraction of wealth continues. And yes, you know, the creation of these divisions was helpful to many different interests in the Middle East, primarily the oil interests, but also the interest of the creation of the state of Israel. Now, what we see happening is all of that is basically coming apart because, because the state of Israel has become predominant in terms of control over the United States, and the United States is no longer seen as a legitimate or truthful guarantor of security for any of the client states that we've had for the last 200 years in the Middle East. And so this whole thing is coming to a head, unfortunately, perhaps in a very ugly way.
Um, you mentioned the control of Israel over the United States. You and I have talked about that on previous shows, really to great extent, more than one show. Um, can you talk a little bit more about uh, what this Wahhabism has done to split Islam? And you referred to the creation of terrorist gangs. And my God, after 9/11, United States foreign policy shifted drastically to the war on terror. Uh, and has this not been used by Israel to advance Israeli interests?
Well, I think the better description is influence. Israel and Zionists have a tremendous amount of influence over United States policy. And I think this is by design. When the clean break report was issued in 1996, one of the things that they suggested is that Israel and Zionists become very much more involved in increasing the amount of influence that they had in the United States Congress. That has been accomplished as a result of money and campaign finance, both at the local and state level and on the congressional and presidential levels. I've written about this. There's no secret. There have been studies. The amount of money that flows from Zionist interests into U.S. campaigns is astonishing. 70% of most of the campaign contributions to the Democrats come from Zionist interests. We've seen how much money President Trump has been able to raise from Zionist interests. And, you know, with money comes a certain amount of influence, and that influence can be interpreted as control. There's no question that the United States is fully in bed with whatever Israel decides to do in the Middle East. And that's not only the Trump administration. Remember, the current crisis in Gaza started back in 1923, and that was under the Biden administration. And the Biden administration did everything Israel wanted in terms of giving Israel free rein to do whatever they needed to do on the Gaza Strip. Did nothing in terms of trying to curtail any of the activities that were going on, despite the fact that it clearly amounted to what could only be called genocide. So this is a bipartisan problem, and it has been going on for a long time. And I think now, finally, it's being discussed across the United States in a way that hasn't really been possible in the past. So that's issue number one, the influence. I don't know if you could call it control. We'll see, but influence. You know, a lot of people think the president of the United States can do anything that he or she wants, but that's not true. There are a number of powerful influences on the president that curtails the activity that a president has to engage in. And a president has to do a little bit of manipulating to get done what he wants to get done. And you can see that in terms of what Trump is doing right now. And I can give you a couple of examples later on if you like, particularly in terms of the Russian Ukraine war. But what the use of Wahhabism, and particularly the use of Sunni fundamentalist Islam, has meant is that the West, through the United States, Britain, France, and Israel, has used terrorism and the creation of terrorism and the support of terrorist gangs as a cudgel to divide the Middle East, to scare the people in the West into supporting war and curtailment of our civil rights, and to increase and make sure that support of Israel is unbroken. And that has been the result. It has been, I think, a very specific strategy that has been intentionally implemented that goes back a long way. And I have to say, it has been very, very successful. Now, I want to close with one point, which I think is very, very important. We've been subjected to a great deal of propaganda about terrorism and about the creation of terrorism and about the use of terrorism. And terrorism is real. People have died. These terrorists are dangerous people, but they are funded and supported by Western interest, period. And so when you talk about terrorism and when you label someone a terrorist, what that means is that person no longer has any civil rights. You can kill them. You can do anything you want to them. It's a very useful description. So are other descriptions that have resulted from this. For example, you know, the Palestinians are terrorism. That way you get to occupy them. That way you get to curtail their movement. That way you get to steal their land. That way you get to attack them. So people say, well, Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel has a right to exist. Well, under international law, you could say Palestine has the right to exist. Palestine has the right to defend itself. And under international law, occupied people, and the West Bank and Gaza has been occupied by Israel since 1967. You can say that occupied people have the right to defend themselves as well. So everybody needs to stop and think about what these labels and terms mean, about where this fear mongering is really coming from and what it's being used for. And it's being used to curtail our rights here in the United States and in the West, and to distract us from what's being done economically and politically to curtail the future of the very young people that Charlie Kirk was talking to every day.
Um, I want to follow up on this, the topic of terrorists and terrorism. Uh, you're surely aware that even before 9/11, Dick Cheney, I don't think George the Cowboy Bush had any idea what was going on, but the Patriot Act was already written, and within a very short time after 9/11, it was enacted, passed in Congress, which started to define any uh, any attack on or anything to discredit the official narrative was considered an act of terrorism. And very shortly after that came the National Defense Authorization Act, which created Homeland Security, and now just increased this awareness of who a terrorist was. They were now right here in the United States of America, and they weren't just Islamic people, Arabs. And then finally, the Domestic Terrorist Act. I mean, you and I, well, I can speak for myself. I'm definitely considered a domestic terrorist. I've been uh, permanently deleted from YouTube for speaking uh, against and exposing the lies of the propaganda coming out of the United States. We're seeing journalists being written off, uh, being attacked, their reputations destroyed, and losing their jobs. So, this idea of silencing people, uh, really undermining what the meaning of the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights was all about. And I think this is really a very troubling thing, and you are so right to point that out. Now, I want to go back to what you've been talking about: divide and conquer
So
in the middle.
I think I want to comment on what you just said, if you don't mind. Um, I think this is all planned, frankly. If you want, if you want to concentrate wealth to the degree that wealth has been concentrated in the United States, if you want to deprive the new generation of people of the opportunities that I, for example, had as a low income individual coming out of South Louisiana, you're going to have the means of enforcing power and control. And so there are many different ways to go about doing that. But the best way to go about doing that is to create a situation where people live in fear and are willing to trade their human rights and their civil rights for security. And in order to do that, you have to create the issues that create the problems that give rise to the fear. Now, there's a situation that was created in the Middle East going all the way back to the Balfour Declaration in 1917, when the British decided that they were going to assist the Zionists in creating a homeland in Palestine for the Jewish people. From the very beginning, it was known that this was not going to be an easy project. The Zionists went out there and came back and said the land is beautiful, but she already has a lover. She's already occupied. There were millions of Palestinians that live there, and the plan had to be implemented that would allow those people to be basically removed from the land so that another people could come in and occupy and create a different country. And so there's been problems from that from the very beginning, from the first Arab wars to all the wars that have been fought since then, to all of the things that have been done to destroy Arab unity, to fracture Arab society, to make sure that Arabs were fighting among themselves, to make sure that the very worst elements within Islam came to the forefront so that they could be tagged as terrorists and so that people would get a bad impression of Islam. people think Islam, the impression that people have of Islam is that of the terrorist with a knife cutting off somebody's head. That was by design. That was as a result of active measures being taken to to create these gangs, to support these gangs. These people, it was a job. If you were an Islamist fundamentalist, there was some place you could go and join a gang and you got paid. Where did the money come from? The money came from the Brits, the money came from the Americans, the money came from the French, and the money came from the Saudis and the others in the Middle East who saw it to their advantage to have these young people leave their country and go fight somebody else somewhere else. So none of this is by accident. The deprivation of the Bill of Rights and the attack on the First Amendment in the United States is a matter of tactics, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is that there are apparently plans to implement some system of control that will allow the current neoliberal economic scheme to continue, will allow the current concentration of wealth to continue, and will allow our society to become increasingly impoverished and lacking in opportunity. And so, before we can even get to the need for a populist movement to absolutely change all of that, we need to understand that when you are a liberal and you have a reaction to the murder of a young father and husband, and you react to that by saying nasty things about him, and you are acting as part of this system to divide and conquer, to keep people from seeing that there's more that unites us than divides us. And until people can get over themselves and be able to see what's happening to them, this is going to continue, Regis, and it's going to continue to get worse. There are plans. There are plans for perhaps a digital currency. There are all sorts of plans. And those plans imply instituting a system of control that will allow the current concentration of wealth to persist.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Uh, it's not accidental. It's one great big huge plan. We're only talking about a couple of parts of it right now, but it is all by design. I appreciate how much you emphasize that. But now I want to get back before we uh, use up too much of this time tonight. I want to get back to what you were talking about in the Middle East, the divide and conquer there. And um, to me, who I I'm more interested in, have focused more of my attention on what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, in this part of the world than I have been in Israel. But I'm paying attention. And one of the things that uh, to me seems obvious is this concept of the greater Israel. It looks to me like Netanyahu and his cabal are looking to completely clean out Gaza and Palestine, and they're not going to stop there. I saw a map of what really is part of the greater Israel, and it even includes parts of Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and maybe even parts of Turkey. Um, what does this mean, Sylvia, for the rest of the Middle East? And one other part I want you to address, what does it mean that the US involvement in all of this is really causing some real change in strategic thinking of the entire Middle East?
Well, the concept of Greater Israel goes back over 100 years. I mean, it was part of the founding of Zionism itself. So this isn't a new concept. What's new is that Netanyahu has recently stated, number one, that Israel has to become an autarky, meaning it has to become completely self-sufficient. And secondly, it has to become like Sparta. Well, Israel is already kind of like Sparta, has been for some time. And then he also endorsed again this concept of Greater Israel. And so, what does Greater Israel involve? Greater Israel involves taking the entire Sinai and part of Egypt all the way to the Nile, as well as most of the coast on the Red Sea. It involves taking all of Jordan. It involves taking all of Lebanon, including the water in the Litani River, the mountains, the coast, the gas resources off the coast, everything. And remember, Lebanon at one time was thought of as the Paris of the East. The Lebanese are just as good a traders and business people as any Jewish person ever thought about being. And Lebanon was one of the coolest places on the planet until Israel started messing around with it. And now the country is so divided. The government has recently said that it wants to disarm Hezbollah, which will of course create another civil war. And this is divide and conquer. And so continuing with Greater Israel, they want all of Syria. And there has been a plot against Syria that's been going all the way back until after 9/11. Timber Sycamore was something that was implemented by Obama, where he funded these gangs to go ahead and and destroy the Syrian government. The Syrian government was a non-secular. It was interested. It had its own problems, but it was at least doing something for its people. Well, all of Syria now is going to become part of Greater Israel. A good part of Saudi Arabia is supposed to become part of Greater Israel, which includes some of the oil fields. All of Kuwait and all of that that energy is supposed to become part of Greater Israel, as well as part of Turkey. So this has been talked about for a long time, but I don't think any of these Arab countries ever took it very seriously because, I mean, a country of 7 million people is going to suddenly take over all these countries. How is that possible? Well, it became clear recently how that's possible because the United States was apparently going to help them do it, I guess. Because what happened is the Arab world began to notice how the United States was just letting Israel bomb anybody they wanted, whether they were in Qatar or any place else. Israel has been bombing Syria for some time. It's been bombing Lebanon for some time. It's been bombing Yemen. Recently bombed Tunis. It's bombing everybody. And so um, when this happened in Qatar, which has been an ally of the United States for some time, that suddenly raised serious concerns. And so a Pan Arab meeting was called, and nothing really concrete came from that other than a statement. Statements don't do anything. But what also happened is Turkey realized that Israel had sold air defense system. Uh, Cyprus is divided between Turkey and Greece. And recently, Greece purchased an air defense system from Israel. And Israel also said that maybe it was time to force Turkey to leave Cyprus. Well, in the meantime, uh, Israelis are purchasing land and building Israeli communities on Cyprus. And so this is another issue that comes up. So you have this issue of Greater Israel. And in the meantime, these Arab countries have been purchasing United States weapons that have these back doors in them, and they have been assisting in U.S. efforts to to protect Israel and to do other things to overthrow countries that the United States disagrees with in the Middle East, et cetera. They've been going along with it, kind of using this divide and conquer because they're suddenly supposed to be enemies with Iran. Well, now Iran and Saudi Arabia have been getting together. Iran and some of these other Middle Eastern countries have been getting together. And what has now been realized is that these U.S. weapons that they've spent billions of dollars purchasing is not going to be able to be used against either the United States or Israel. So these countries realized they were basically defenseless. It's been a concern for a long time that Saudi Arabia and Pakistan would get together because Pakistan is a nuclear power state. It's thought that Saudi Arabia has been part and parcel of helping finance some of that, and so there's been a real concern that some agreement would be reached between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan that would extend a nuclear umbrella over the Middle East. And now we find out that just such an agreement has been entered into. And it does, in fact, extend a nuclear umbrella over the Middle East. And this is a real game changer. It means that this is a new era in the Middle East, and I think we need to seriously pay attention to it. What it means is that the fact that you're a client state of the United States does not mean that the United States will protect you if some bigger allies' interests are involved. And that bigger ally in the Middle East is Israel. And so what we see happening now, I think, is serious questions being raised around the world as to whether or not being a client state of the United States and falling under the protection of the United States military really means anything when the chips are down. And I want to segue for just a moment to Russia and Ukraine because, Regis, unfortunately, these two wars are interconnected. They're all part of the same pattern, and they're all being pushed by the same interest. And believe it or not, Israel is involved in the war between Russia and Ukraine as well. Now, Russia has 2 million Russian Jewish citizens who are part of Israel, and Russia bends over backwards to try to get along with Israel and to maintain good relations with Israel. But the Ashkenazi people have a bone to pick with Russia that goes all the way back to Catherine the Great. When Catherine the Great took over that part of Eastern Europe that had several million Ashkenazi Jews living in it and created what was called the Pale of Settlement for these people to live in. It created a great deal of discord and a great deal of resentment on the part of Ashkenazi Jews, and they haven't forgotten. And I think in many respects they see Russia as an enemy, and they want to see Russia brought to heel. And so I think they have cooperated with the West in creating the conditions that forced Russia to invade Ukraine and to force the continuation of this war. I want to make one more point, and it's a little out of our topic, but I think it's important. People are wondering about what the Russian and Chinese strategy might be in this very perilous age that we face because we are on the brink of I think World War III has already started. The question will be how far will it spread? How many countries will become involved? And what will be the consequences? And in particular, whether or not we will end up with a nuclear war. And I think Russia and China, being the great civilizations that they are perfectly aware of what the consequences and what the reality of the situation is. And so people have been very critical of Russia for not rushing, for not trying to get this war over with. But what's going on here is it's a war of attrition. And what is being done is the Western world is being worn down. It's being worn down in terms of patience. It's being worn down in terms of money. It's being worn down in terms of propaganda, exposing the lies. And in particular, it's being worn down in terms of the ability to produce the weapons of war. We see that happening in Ukraine, where now there's a real serious question as to whether or not the weapons that are needed for that war can continue to be produced. We see that in Israel, where the question is now raised as to whether or not there will be a second Israeli Iran war, and if that happens, whether or not the weapons will be available to protect Israel. Because remember, Israel was only able to protect itself from about a third of the missiles that Iran fired. The rest of those missiles were dealt with to the extent that they were, and a lot of them got through by the United States assets in the region. The United States used almost a third of not only all the weapons that were in our arsenal, but all of the weapons that had been ever produced. And so there's a real issue here about whether or not the Western world has the capacity to produce the weapons that they want to have hegemony over the globe. And so that is what the United States is dealing with right now. And that's why we're seeing some of the things happen that we're seeing happening in the United States, where the United States is beginning to withdraw from other parts of the world and coming home to this hemisphere to try to decide what the future will be for U.S. power.
Wow, I'm really glad that you segued into Russia and China and wondering just what their strategy is. I think it's pretty obvious. Humanity owes a great debt of gratitude to Putin for being so patient and not being provoked by so many serious incursions, attacks into the Russian mainland, the killing of civilians. Another one just happened yesterday here in the Crimea. Less than 30 miles from where I live, there was a school that was hit with a drone and a five-star resort that was also hit while a very high-profile wedding was taking place. And so everybody is beginning to say and have been saying, well, why isn't Putin doing something? Why doesn't he stop it? I think it's because of what you said. China and Russia completely understand what's going on. You mentioned it. You talked about a war of attrition, and you said that the United States and the West has been going down for some time, in decline economically, politically, socially, and in terms of their influence around the world. Uh, I think this is extremely important. And then you mentioned that you think that we're already in World War III. I think we are too. Uh, it just hasn't broken out into a World War II type of battle. It hasn't gone nuclear in terms of using tactical nukes. A lot of people are talking about that. But when you look at the conflict that the United States and the West have been creating in the Middle East, which is now, I think, a hair trigger away from turning nuclear because of what you just said. There's a balance now. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which is a nuclear armed nation, and Israel, which is nuclear armed. And then you look at Russia and China and North Korea, all nuclear armed countries who are under assault. I'm really quite afraid, Sylvia, that I don't know if there's a Dr. Strangelove out there who could push the button, but the chance for an accident, a, a chance for a misjudgment, a misreading of a radar screen, for example, uh, is greater now than I think it's ever been. I want you to finish up on how you trend, how you segue from what United States strategy seems to be, and that is a pivot to the Americas, to the Western Hemisphere. Talk to me a little bit about that and how you see that unfolding.
Well, the first thing I want to say is I think that humanity is fortunate at this moment in time to have leadership in Russia, like Russia has with Vladimir Putin, and to have a civilizational state like China that has been a civilization for over 2,000 years. These people don't act lightly. They consider all the consequences, and they don't want this to go nuclear. Now, are they going to be able to prevent this World War III scenario from expanding and going nuclear? I don't know. But I do feel that they are trying. And I also wonder, Donald Trump ran as the peace president. He's going to give a speech at the United Nations tomorrow. We'll see what he says. But hopefully, President Trump understands that what the consequences of expansion into a total World War III scenario would be. He's a builder. Buildings don't survive wars very well. So hopefully, the president of peace will segue to peace, and that will, and he'll be able to control the forces for war in the United States, which are many and numerous and quite powerful. And we'll see what happens. And yes, it does appear that the United States is planning on focusing on the hemisphere. But I'm afraid, at least initially, the focus is misplaced. I'm not fond of this flotilla of warships off the coast of Venezuela. I mean, it's obvious Venezuela has the largest oil deposits in the world. Our the refineries in the United States are geared for that oil. We confiscated a Venezuelan firm, Costco. I don't think we ever paid Conoco. I can't remember I think it's Costco. I don't think we ever paid them a dime for that. We've been confiscating their oil. I don't think we ever paid them a dime for that. So it's a bad look to think that the United States is going to try to do something in Venezuela to take control of that oil. And also, I don't think it's a very good idea. Venezuela is holding military uh, events as we speak. They have militias all over the country. If the United States thinks we're going to walk into Venezuela and take the oil and have it be a cakewalk, I think they're seriously mistaken. Not only that, I don't think the rest of the countries in Central and South America are going to look favorably to an attack on a country in South America. So I don't know what's going on, but I hope that what's going on is not what appears to be going on, and that whatever it is that's the Trump strategy with this will become apparent, and that all of the rhetoric and the threats will subside, and that there will not be a war in this hemisphere focused on oil like there has been wars in the Middle East focused on oil.
Um, I'm not so hopeful that the United States is changing its foreign policy. Members of administration, uh, especially the Pete Hegseth, who's now the head of the Department of War, and one of his top generals have indicated that the United States is going to go to war with China between 2025 and 2026. Uh, the United States has pivoted once again to Asia, completely surrounding Russia with bases and missiles. Same thing has happened surrounding Russia, with annual war games getting more intense and larger in both hemispheres, both regions. Uh, and then when you connect that with what the United States is doing in the Middle East and the threat that that poses to people like Pakistan, India, Turkey, uh, the United States to me doesn't look like it's pulling back any of its soft power or hard power to create chaos and the threats of war all over the place. Um,
Well, Regis, there's rhetoric and then there's reality.
yeah.
Yes, there's a lot of rhetoric. A lot of people have made their livelihood on war and on talks of war and on fighting war. Those wars in the recent past have not gone very well for the United States. We had to abandon Afghanistan without any victory. We had to leave Iraq without totally subjugating that country. We are not, the United States is not in a position to fight a conventional war against either Russia or China. Surely, I don't care how much money you make from militarism, and all of these people in Washington, D.C. are either getting money from militarism or getting money from Zionism or getting money as a result of the war contracts. I don't care how much money you make. At some point, you have to look at the facts and you have to look at reality. And the reality is that the United States does not have the capacity to fight a conventional war against either Russia or China, and certainly not in combination. The big brains behind our foreign policy have been so smart that they have created conditions where what are seen as enemies of the United States have united and are now signing treaties together and unifying their militaries to fight war. And so now you're not only looking at Russia and China, you're looking at Russia and China and Iran and North Korea and maybe even Brazil and ultimately perhaps even India, certainly Pakistan. So yes, there's a lot of rhetoric, and I'm not saying that that rhetoric can't be reality, because there are idiots, and we have seen the result of idiocy in U.S. foreign policy for some time. But hopefully, reality will win the day, And people will realize that the attempt to fight a conventional war will result in the defeat of the United States. And in order to not be defeated, the United States will probably turn to nuclear weapons, and that will be the end of humanity on Earth. And surely people are smart enough to not go that far.